Okay, so we are on air. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is an online panel on disinformation and how it can prove to be a threat to democracy. My name is Rishim Wasim. I am a Hereford Youth Fellow with the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm a filmmaker, and I will be taking all the research that we will be doing here and combining it into a mini web series that deals with the various questions we have about the future and survival of democracy. So let me first introduce our lovely global panel who has been nice enough to take out the time from their day to talk to us. First of all, we have Yuan Chua. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. She is the assistant professor at the Department of Journalism at the University of the Philippines, and she is supervising Vera Files Fact Check as its project director. For those of you who don't know, Vera Files is a nonprofit online news organization, and she has been doing a lot of work on researching on the misinformation ecosystem in the Philippines. Then we have Kurutalan Zaman, who is a journalist and human rights activist who has been doing this work for the past 10 years. She is originally from Pakistan, but she has worked in Germany, Britain, and is currently based in Myanmar. She has also previously worked with the Rory Peck Trust, where she worked on how to support the safety and welfare of freelance news gatherers from Asia. Then we have Vladan Djukonovic from Serbia. He's the coordinator of the Secretariat of the World Youth Movement for Democracy. He basically heads this whole youth initiative from Serbia, and has a lot of interest in how tools, interactive media, web tools could be used to encourage youth activism. And lastly, we have Dean Jackson. He is the Assistant Program Officer for the National Endowment for Democracy. He also works at the Forum on issues relating to disinformation. And he is, like I said before, a resident expert on disinformation. So we all kind of have an idea what we're going to talk about here today. We're going to talk about disinformation. We're going to talk about how it is polluting the information space. We are, oh my, sorry, just give me a sec. Of how it's polluting disinformation space. According to a survey done by Freedom House in 2017, 18 countries have had their elections affected by disinformation. So clearly it is a serious issue that needs to be talked about, but there are so many different layers to it. So it's clearly a very complex issue. So I would first like to start with an impossible question. And you all are please welcome to give us your thoughts about it, but I would like to start with you.
Sure.
Should the digital information space, essentially the internet, be regulated, and who gets to decide to do it? Like, who gets to be in charge of regulating it?
Sure. So I think that's a good place to start, and it's an extremely timely question. I guess to begin, I'd say that in some ways it already is regulated. There's just recently the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union has sort of come to pass. That's a series of privacy protections for user data that is going to have implications for not just how the data of their users and the ability to target advertisements at them, but it's going to have implications for email marketing, for how journalists interact with their sources. It's very wide-ranging because the European Union is such a big market, and because the regulation applies to anyone who interacts with users residing in the European Union, it will have implications for activity beyond Europe. In the United States, there's an ongoing debate about how to regulate political advertising on the platforms. That may spill over into privacy issues as well. There are various hate speech regulations. So all this stuff is out there. The question is, to what degree does it apply to online space? To what degree are additional regulations necessary? And as you said, who decides? I think there needs to be, I think, a robust conversation in which civil society is very engaged about what kinds of partnerships tech platforms need to enter into with civil society, but also what kinds of government regulations need to exist. What we want to avoid is allowing private companies to set the rules unilaterally for public spaces, but we also want to avoid allowing governments to be too heavy-handed. If governments come down too hard on regulating online speech, then in some spaces, that's lamentable, but in relatively democratic spaces where there's rule of law, where there's government accountability, where there's sort of appeals processes, that's one problem. But in spaces where those protections don't exist, in more liberal or authoritarian spaces, I think governments will be more than happy to use the disinformation problem online as an excuse to crack down on legitimate political criticism of the government or unpopular speech or speech by minority groups. You can imagine how a too heavy-handed approach gives government far too much latitude to regulate. So there needs to be a conversation in which we find the right balance, and all three of those sectors need to be engaged in that conversation.
And like taking a cue from that, Yuvan, I would like to ask you that the issue of disinformation it plays out differently at the Southeast Asian context, because we do have these rules and these laws that curb freedom of expression, and and it is being used. This is exactly what's happening. It recently happened in Malaysia, where the excuse of fake news is being used to create laws which are essentially creating censorship opportunities for the state. So how is it different? Like, it's a different, I feel like, is it really a global solution that's going to be like one size fits all, or do we really have to look at regional approaches to this issue? What would you have to like say about that?
Um, of course, regulation usually has to start at the national level, at the country level. But like what Dean said, it's very important to involve all the stakeholders, civil society, media, the users, the tech companies there. I think it has to be a multi-level approach, because where if you have a national initiative and you have something like Malaysia, then the regional would hopefully serve as a foil to attempts to muzzle or to restrict freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and become a form of censorship. And of course, as we know, going global is likewise important. So dialogue among regions, and of course, um, I think it's not just Malaysia that we're closing tracking how Malaysia is going to use the law. In other parts of Southeast Asia, we know that Singapore also is considering a law. And then we're also still watching how Germany has been enforcing the law, especially against hate speech. So it's pretty much uncharted territory right now in terms of regulation. But these are, I mean, where countries have begun embracing this, I think we're really watching them closely. In the case of the Philippines, we of course have there have been proposed legislation against disinformation, fake news in particular, and of course possible regulation of platforms. But the position that a lot of us have taken is um, we don't really need a lot of legislation, and where there should be regulation, it should not infringe on our existing freedoms or rights.
And again, taking a cue from that, Annie, you have a very unique experience because you have worked as a journalist and worked with journalists in countries like Germany, like Pakistan, and now again you're based in Myanmar, which also has a lot of same elements that we find in other Southeast Asian countries. So, how do you see this playing out globally, but yet the regional limitation that different countries have can also be used to manipulate the regulations? Oh, unfortunately, I'm sorry, Annie, we kind of lost your audio. Can you maybe sign out and then click the link again? Hopefully that will work. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. But Vladin, like, since it's gonna, well, we are doing an online discussion, these things are bound to happen. But Vladin, if you could, since you also are from a different part of the world, where again is it basically global versus regional, what are your thoughts on this particular issue?
Yes, I live in Europe, where there is a lot of regulation and different kind of efforts against hate speech, for example. But unpopularity of general regulation is also quite present. I work in a global context within the World Youth Movement for Democracy, and what I can say is that easy global solution, it's really, really hard to achieve. So what we as activists need to do is get ourselves familiar with examples of other parts of the world. That is, world is getting more and more global, but our actions sometimes needs to go more and more local. And how to make a compromises between those two situations is like to try to find similar problems and in other parts of the world, in other countries, and then try to use their knowledge, their experience in order to create some response for the local context. I don't think that quite soon we will have a proper global solution. Instead of that, we will just have replication of issues as authoritarian regimes are, I think, learning from each other much faster than activists from our different parts of the world are learning from each other. So that is the solution I think that we need to start using in order to have a proper response, to start learning more from each other and to duplicate some of the good examples that are fit for our local contexts.
Thank you. That's a great observation. Annie, I'm crossing fingers that we can hear you now. Can you say something so we can check?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect. We can.
Okay. Yeah. So I've missed the last point to what he was saying, but I'll just pick it up from where I left. That it's actually I don't see any we can't have any global solution because every region, like the media landscape or media ecosystem is different. You know, what we see in Germany is different than what we see in Myanmar or in Pakistan. For example, in Pakistan, what we see is we can't even call it a liberal democracy. It's more like military managed democracy, be it Myanmar, be it Pakistan or Myanmar, where I'm based right now. And in these countries, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to ask for. What we see is propaganda or fake news coming from state-sponsored, proxies. Some people we do have bots here as well, but they're state sponsored, and it's clearly seen that who has that much funds or that much support to come out and talk about to bring out that kind of propaganda to influence citizen choices in democracies like Pakistan, for example. And in Pakistan, this is an election year, so we see so much happening right now. I would like to give one example, which is current after the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal, which broke out internationally. So what happened in Pakistan is one website, which is not even Pakistani website, and it's Eurasia Future. And apparently one journalist digged out, Umar Ali, and found out that it's funded by Russia. And they put out one story about Pakistan, that hacking democracy, that the former disqualified Premier Nawaz Sharif, and he actually paid Cambridge Analytica to spread or change citizens' perception. But that was all a fake news. It was written in a way, and it came out at that certain point last month, in end of March, that everyone started sharing it, be it any political leader or experts, without seeing that, okay, there are no particular sources quoted. So here I would like to say that why I think that we need regional or country-wise solutions for it, because in Pakistan, we don't have that much of digital literacy as well. As, for example, if we mention Germany or we mention England, or maybe we have some similarities with the Philippines or Malaysia or Thailand, where we have some kind of, repressive government.
Yeah, and you just brought me to my next point, which is about media literacy. Because yes, there are things that can be done on a more higher level with regulations and laws and things that Facebook and Google could be doing to regulate them, make their algorithms better. But at the end, it all kind of also boils down to the consumer, to the average human being who is actually taking in that content and then spreading it. So there have been echoes of media literacy, people do talk about it, but it does seem, how would you even define media literacy? And is it really a viable thing to get people to critically evaluate and almost investigate if what they're reading is true or not? How does like media literacy, how can we make it like viably work on media literacy, and how do we even define media literacy? Yvonne, I would like to start with you with that because you are a professor of journalism.
Okay, I think there are a lot of media literacy modules out there, and it's too wide and covers too many areas, especially if you were to do a course itself, whether it's in high school or in college. Given the state of disinformation right now, my own inclination is to narrow it down a bit to focus on news literacy, to start with that,
Mm-hmm.
so people can tell us, as the training of
Mhm.
journalists is of course to verify, to find out what's true, to establish what is factual, and differentiated from opinion or reasoned judgment. And so my pitch oftentimes is that, true, we start with news literacy and then expand it to explain to people how do you now engage the different media platforms when you discover something that is fake. Because if you start with this is the medium, okay, these are the media, these are the different, or I mean it's just too many. You should see you know our government introduced 2 years ago a media literacy module in senior high school, and I've examined it, and it's just like it combines just nearly everything that has to do with media, even those that are, and it doesn't improve your understanding of the content. It's more like the form, the platform. And given the state of disinformation right now, it's so important for us to focus on deconstructing the content, telling what's true and false. And I've always believed that let's start with news literacy, making them understand. Is it worth trying? Yes, we've gone around. As part of our fact checking workshops, we do promote news literacy as part of that. And we notice that even young ones, those in grade school or high school, are able to grasp the concept. But you really have to make them in come in bits and pieces that are digestible rather than
Hmm.
dump like a whole semester like a collegiate course on
Yeah.
citizens.
Yeah. And like Dean, since we are at like the net and we do kind of get a global idea because we have grantees who are telling us what they're doing. And so have you been coming across any interesting research or things that are being done on media literacy that would be worth sharing here?
Yeah, this is a really hot topic right now. People are really, I think, invested in the idea of media literacy as part of the solution to this. I think it's really important. There was a really excellent literature review that came out of the Data and Society Institute. I
Mm.
believe the author was Monica Boulder, and it was reviewing media literacy programs around the world and the approach they took and their effectiveness. I think it very much was in line with what you said, Yvonne, about media literacy being a very wide term, and I think it makes some effort to narrow down. Well, this program was really trying to teach people these skills, and here is sort of whether or not we thought it was successful. It was really about evaluating the success or failure of various programs, and I think that would be really useful for people who sort of say we need more media literacy, but want to make that next step to figure out how to implement a media literacy program. That would be a good starting point. There are good models out there. I think there have been some really interesting efforts in Ukraine, which of course is rife with disinformation. Tied to a military conflict, it's a huge problem for Ukrainian society. But because it's such a huge problem, it's galvanized a lot of attention and a lot of efforts to respond to the problem. And so there has been an interesting sort of train the trainers approach through, I believe, IREX is the group that implemented this, and they they train people to then go into their libraries and schools and community places and do media literacy trainings themselves. So you get the media literacy training from someone you already sort of trust and are invested in, rather than from a Western NGO that you might have minimal personal relationship with. That has been successful. And one of the things I think that they really impress on their trainers and therefore their trainees is there's an emotional component to disinformation that is, you need to be literate in the way that disinformation can manipulate your feelings and your identity. If you're reading a piece of news that doesn't cite any individual expert sources, it doesn't really offer any concrete evidence, but really makes you angry or anxious or afraid, they really, I think, impress upon their recipients, well, take a step back and ask yourself if someone might be benefiting from those emotions, and if those emotions are warranted. Are you sure that this is true? And once people start to do that, I think they have gone back and tried to evaluate their own programs and found that that does stick with a reasonable number of people. And people sort of do start to process the news in a different way and understand the ways that information can be manipulated by bad actors. So it's a huge, complex area, and anyone who thinks that you can sort of do this in a week-long course in high schools to teach people how to spot fake news sites is I think doing themselves a disservice. But
yeah. And do you also think, like, this is kind of for everyone, but media literacy, is it also kind of linked to internet literacy? Because, you know, in the country that I am from, in Pakistan, not lots of people have access to the internet. So that they're already not realizing that how the internet can work sometimes makes them more vulnerable to it. And particularly, I want to also ask you, Vladin, that are young people more vulnerable to it in a way because we are literally the products of the social media like generation, or in some ways maybe we're better off because since we've always grown up with this, we know how it works. So those are if anyone can answer the first part of it and the second part.
Yeah, internet and young people are quite interconnected in this question. On one hand, young people are blessed with growing up with the internet and having a completely different mindset that enables them to easily access some information. On the other hand, what internet has brought is a completely new type of media that people who create content don't always understand. And that's where the problem with media literacy today, I think, is the strongest. It's not only about the consumer. Now we have journalists and people who are not trained journalists who are creating some kind of news and content without proper media literacy of their own in order to be able to fact check everything that they are writing. Now with a bunch of online portals, we have people who are more working on rewriting stories and making stories in just like a few minutes in order to push them to have something that is clickable, that a lot of people will see, that banners will pop up, etc. That media literacy and facts are neglected in that way. And when it comes to young people, their approach to information is much different than what we are used to in traditional media and a bit older generation. Authorities are completely shaken, and that is especially seen in some societies where media were not well established and independent before internet revolution. For example, we often hear that internet is providing a lot of fake news, that there is a lot of tabloid press or reality programs that are affecting negative to youth. But that is, for some societies, worse than in others. For example, if you see UK, you will see the worst tabloids, maybe, with some news, but also you have well-established news outlets and media outlets. So I think this is also a question that highly varies from region to region, and where we need to have deeper understanding of circumstances, like you mentioned for the Pakistan and the internet. And in order to fight disinformation, we need to be one step ahead. And if Pakistan now is at low level of internet usage, somebody who wants to make some change in Pakistan should see how internet penetration had affected similar societies, to be able to predict how, when internet usage increases rapidly, which will probably be in just like few years, how to provide a proper information.
Yeah, exactly. And like Annie, what I also would like to hear your comment.
I would like to,
yeah,
I would like to add another perspective here, that it's not only in countries like Pakistan, what we see there, it's not only the internet or the digital space which is bringing in fake news a lot. We see a trend in the last few years that electronic media basically is also a part of that, bringing up fake news, putting stories, fabricated stories, doing basically traditional media as well is not trying to help in here. The bigger TV channels or bigger local newspapers, they are not investing much in good journalism or investigative journalism. We don't see a trend in Pakistan of investigative journalism. There's no tradition we see in Pakistani media ecosystem, which is very damaging for a democracy or like a transition to democracy, because what we already have in Pakistan is not a good like liberal democracy. It's more like, as I mentioned earlier, it's more military managed democracy. So it's quite worrisome for everyone, you know, who want the country like have a free and fair, you know, kind of environment, and like free speech as well. So digital media, I think in Pakistan space, I understand, like, you know, as a millennial, your point of view that you think all information is coming from net. But from my generation and what I look, you know, I feel that, you know, it's still TV, you know, the TV channels, TV anchors, they bring up, for example, I mentioned earlier about this Studio Future fake story which came out. None of the TV channels anchors, so-called big experts, did a little investigation, or they didn't have any news sense. They started like talking about the same news story. It became a headline in every like breaking headline, or kind of like the anchors talking about it. So which is wrong, you know. So what I feel, it's a very I'm sorry, like for academics, they are good examples or theories that okay, we should do bring up some courses or do teacher training or train or TOTs, but I don't see if it's going to help in, like, you know, it would take like years. It can't happen overnight, you know, that people will start believing or they would have understanding what is right or what is wrong, because here is like whole state machinery, you know, whole propaganda machinery bringing some news, for example, like which is fake. So how can, you know, for example, people like who want to bring in good journalism, you know, how many channels or how many newspapers country like Pakistan who want to come out, you know, and talk about it. For example, right now in Pakistan, we see the biggest media house, Geo, is like gone, it's censored. It's been 3 months, and it's not coming on like any household, and they are under pressure. And there's so many like experts or columnists, their newspapers are refusing, you know, their write-ups. So there's like a censorship, there's a tradition as well. People are trying to speak up, but they're being curbed. And when military might, like, military is so strong, you know, what can you do? So we need to think about solutions for that, you know, how to bypass that censorship, how to train journalists or like human rights defenders to bring their voices out of the country. Because I don't think that right now in the US or in Europe, people do understand what's happening in Pakistani media.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting point that you pointed out about the link between the more traditional media, because right now, for the longest time, we just automatically do connect disinformation to the digital information space because it has become more enhanced and it has recently become more of a problem because of the internet. But I'm sure there have always been traces, and we can't really ignore that particular segment. So, Yvonne, like I would like to ask you, in the Philippines, how do you see that connection between the traditional media? Is it trying to kind of help the more independent media that is online, or is it kind of trying to uphold the status quo? How is that kind of uh, playing its role in the whole larger debate?
Okay. We have an interesting media landscape in the sense that you have those who strive to remain independent and perform the watchdog role of a media. So the problem with that sector is that once you become critical of government, you have no less than the president breathing down your necks and threatening you with closure, with refusal to um, renew your franchise. And that really has a chilling effect. And for those who and it's not just the president, then everything follows. On online, you are the object of bullying and all. And a lot of journalists have also pointed out that they don't exactly get the full support of their newsrooms. I won't name, but in a forum, some of them say that some of the newsroom owners are rather hesitant to give all out support because they don't want to antagonize the government that has control over your franchise, over your licenses, and of course can file tax evasion cases against you. But and but on the other hand, we also have the media, newsrooms. They are really pro government that blindly follow or toe the line, and they're the ones who sadly attack their counterparts in the media who try to also expose wrongdoings or acts of injustices so it's like sometimes even within the same even the media itself, you have a lot of infighting going, happening. Maybe one bright spot, however, is recently a small group of media organizations, including big newsrooms such as the Philippine Daily Inquirer, which is the largest paper, ANC, which is the largest network. We've actually formed we organized the first a democracy and disinformation conference to actually take on or look into this issue, including what the media has done or has not done in order to curb disinformation, especially since disinformation comes chiefly from the state as well as its cohorts. Just wanted to add something to what Annie pointed out about it's not just traditional media. In the case of the Philippines, our disinformation architects, they're so well versed with the platform, and it's not just internet or your desktop, but mobile. And a lot of Filipinos consume their information through mobile. They don't even go through, they don't even know how to use Google. It used to be like a few years ago, you'd say, oh, go to Google. But now they just rely on free Facebook for the information. And that's really scary because we know that free Facebook can truncate or abbreviate the news. You don't get the whole picture. You get it from friends, from family. And so these are things that come out of your echo chambers. And it's not just the Philippines that is experiencing that. Other countries, including Myanmar, is also going through that phase because I've put in a little work in Myanmar doing workshops on data journalism there. And in the course of training journalists there, I asked them, so how do you research? Some of them aren't really, their main source of information is through the mobile phone, through Facebook. And that's kind of sad because journalists in some parts, especially in emerging democracies or new democracies like Myanmar, they're not equipped with the tools also to filter what's true or what's false.
Yeah, yeah. And like the thing that both you and actually Valen touched upon is like the journalist. I mean, they, in a way, they are like the perpetrators of the problem, but they're also the victims of it as well. Because essentially, what fake news is doing is it's making you not trust your local media, your independent media, and it's making it more difficult for them to survive. And that also kind of contributes a whole different threat to the issue of disinformation, because then you're closing these people who are giving you information that you need to be politically active and be politically aware. And that's another way it's kind of threatening our democracies. So how do you guys see that panning out in your particular countries and in the work that you guys are doing?
Well, journalists are under threat from so many different sides. First, we have democracy decline that is global by Freedom House reports. We can see that for 12 last years, it's declining all over the world. So in so many places, it's harder and harder to be journalists by every day. Also, this technological change that is happening is making them harder to approach some of the information. It is making it easier for some aspects, but also it's creating kind of mushy news sources where even they cannot know whom to trust. And also, after the world economic crisis 10 years ago, it's shown that position of media is deteriorating in some aspects, and journalists are less and less paid all over the world. So all of those aspects are making it harder for journalists to sustain a level of quality of their work that we here are expecting, and so many other consumers of media content. So it's hard to find one solution. On the one hand, we need to understand the situation for journalists, but on the other hand, we cannot lose our expectations in quality of journalism.
Yeah, Annie, I'm sure you have something to say because you have been a journalist for so long and also worked in these different countries with such different relationships with, the state and the situation that is.
I think I think there's a rise in restrictions to report about anything. That's the general trend we see throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia, that there are more restrictions, and it's very difficult for any journalist to report independently. And if they do so, they have to do it. They put themselves at risk when they do it, and we see that particularly throughout the region, be it Myanmar, where currently we are seeing two of our colleagues who are alone on two Reuters journalists who are facing trial at the moment, and they are not it's not only one case. In the last 6 months, there are more than 10 independent journalists who have faced criminal charges. And then if I talk about Pakistan, in Pakistan, journalists, it's not only criminal charges, they're life-threatening, issues. Journalists are being attacked in broad daylight by unknown people. They're being picked up. They are last year, we have seen four independent bloggers who were very critical of the military, and they were being picked up. Initially, their pages were just evaporated from Facebook, and there's so many things happening. If we look at India, for example, what's happening there, we see Indian Kashmir, two of journalists, photojournalists who were actually caught between the pallets. They were palleted, and it was not even reported initially because they couldn't get the news out. We see for 6 months there was no internet, and newspapers are not coming out from the valley. Then we see in Chhattisgarh, we see a total blackout. It's very difficult to get the news out from there. There's so many pockets within the region that we don't get the information out, and it's so difficult. People sitting in Berlin, New York, and London, they don't know and get. Although Asia is ahead, time wise, and our news comes out early when people in the US are sleeping, but still to get our information there is so difficult. And journalists, they are facing so many problems every day. They are literally in Asia, they are in distress, and not their families as well. So their life is at risk daily, and many end up. What we see a trend in, for example, Pakistan, that many are ending up in exile, for example. And we see now a big media in exile, like a diaspora, and they're not the traditional one. We see a couple of new initiatives coming out from people in exile. So that's the only way to bring your news out. If you're sitting in the country and talking or bringing good journalism or good stories, then your life is at risk. You're doing it, by putting yourself at a great danger.
Yeah. And if because I know you and I were at the same conference that Seema did about with the decline. So if you can talk about some ways that some work that is being done to work with a journalist to kind of regain that trust that people have in it, to kind of protect the little guy, that independent journalist is working at home from his laptop.
So there are, well, I should say that trust in media it's a really big, complicated topic, and lots of people are talking about it all of a sudden. But I don't think we quite have our heads wrapped around on what it means when people say they distrust the media. I think it could be that people think that the media are dishonest. Certainly, there's research indicating that large numbers of news consumers read things in the news that they think could just be entirely fabricated. And I think that is, in many contexts, being weaponized against journalists. We referenced earlier the fake news law in Malaysia. Malaysia, not trying to single out Malaysia because it's far from the only country that is considered or taken up legislation like this, but an attempt to criminalize the publication of fake news in major newspapers sort of misses the point of fake news. Fake news, that term came about as sort of commercial hoax sites on the internet, not as a result of journalistic mistakes or malpractice. But publics don't, I think, understand that totally. They think when they hear that there's disinformation or that there's fake news or that you can't trust the media, their immediate sort of thought as well, in my local newspaper or on the television, is this material really true? And it's not to say that journalists don't ever make mistakes, but journalistic mistakes by objective, independent journalists are a different sort of thing than attempts to politically manipulate the public square. And what sort of a liberal or authoritarian leaders have been able to do is take that threat of manipulation and use it against journalists. There are attempts, I think, for journalists to build more genuine connections with users, to directly connect to their communities. I'm really glad someone mentioned the funding model for journalism, because the economic environment for news around the world is very bad and only really getting worse. But attempts there have been newspapers around the world that have managed to find a genuine connection with their audience and communicate that journalism is really important, and have seen their subscriptions go up. I just read a story of a Polish newspaper. Poland is sort of going through a period of uncertainty in its politics right now, but a Polish newspaper has managed to sort of make itself valuable to its readers in a way that they're willing to pay for it. And that's something we haven't seen a lot of newspapers do in a long time. So the more that journalists are able to build genuine connections and sort of demonstrate their value to readers, and the more that civil society is able to communicate to readers, look, journalism is important for your democracy. These aren't, they're not sort of criminals or politically underhanded people. Most journalists are trying to provide a service. The more we're able to do that, I think the more we can start to see that trust sort of come back.
Yeah. And like, what's the, because I know that in the Philippines, you already have mentioned that Rappler and Files both get under threat because of the things that they do say is against what the status quo is or what the administration is doing. So what is the situation, like if for an average journalist in that region, is it very dangerous? Are they still trusted? Are they not? What's the particular context in the Philippines for regarding?
Yeah, like what trust in the media. I think what government has been attempting is to chip away trust in the media, and to a certain degree, there was a survey in late last year that showed that trust in the media actually hasn't declined overall, but um, though the netizens' trust in the media, in the Philippine media, has gone down significantly. So you can see that overall, I mean, it's not. But if you go and ask an average online Filipino, the trust in the media is that low, because the government actually has also used the internet as a battlefront against the media. And so that's where we have to, for journalists, we have to fight. We have to fight for our freedom and our on several fronts. Um, it's like in terms of newspaper, the reach is really small. So what we have to rely on largely is for radio and television to continue to do, like Vladin pointed out, deliver quality journalism in order to maintain that trust. And it's a lot of work as far as social media, especially, is concerned, where how do we regain that trust? Because even, guys, look, even for fact checking right now, which is intended to flush out disinformation, they are really undermining and attacking the fact checkers themselves, calling us calling us partisan, calling us unfair, calling us biased. And how do you fight that? One of the ways that, at least at Verifiles, is we explain our role very clearly. Been very clear about explaining the standards of our, that we do have standards for fact checking. We keep explaining our methodology so that you know that we just don't do it, like we don't just grab ideas out of the blue and put it there in our website. Some are convinced, some are not. But my point is, you just don't waver despite all the attacks. You just have to keep plodding on and sticking to all those standards. I've been a journalist for 37 years, including during the Marcos era. And I know I work for the alternative media. And I know how difficult it was just getting the truth out during the Marcos years. When I work with the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, it was very difficult to go up against a corrupt president like President Estrada. And sometimes people discredit your work. But somehow, someday, somewhere, somebody's going to find out the truth. And if journalists don't stick to telling the truth and seeking the truth, who's going to do it? So all we have to do is just keep looking back. Sometimes I tell people, keep looking back, draw courage and inspiration from journalists who went before us, even those who maybe overthrew colonial regimes, repressive regimes, and just keep going on. Don't abandon the fight because it's become very difficult.
Thank you so much for those inspiring words, because the more I've done research on this, it seems like a rabbit hole. The more you think about it, the more scared you get, and the more you realize we're all doomed. So it's good to hear that there are interesting, creative things that we all can be doing. And I just want to, like, we don't have much time left, but I just want to let people know that if they want to ask any question, that do not realize it will mirror itself and not. But it's hashtag WYMD talk. So if you guys do want to ask us something, just tweet at that. And while you do that or not do that, we're going to send this, and according the true tradition of what you want said, we're going to put it out there and someone's going to see it, and hopefully this will help. It will keep doing what we keep doing. But I would love to have you guys say any last comments that I was not able to ask, things that you want to refer to someone else that someone said that made you want to say something. So if you can just take turns, starting from you, Dean, just any ending comments on our discussion today.
Well, I think it's been a really good discussion. I think you've done a great job pulling the questions together, and all the panelists have really been impressive. I think, going back to media literacy, one thing I meant to say that I didn't was another component of that is algorithmic literacy. People need to understand why they're shown the news they're shown on social media platforms. And I think, I guess my final comment will be to tie it back to something that Yvonne brought up. There are countries, whole countries, many of them, where Facebook is essentially the internet. And so that algorithmic literacy component is going to be especially important there. We should be thinking more about those societies and how vulnerable the combination of a poor funding environment for independent media, high reliance on digital media, and in some instances, liberal political actors who have an incentive to take advantage of those first two factors how that combination of things leaves those societies vulnerable to manipulation by disinformation. We should be thinking about responses for them too when we have, where I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, when we have conversations here about solutions for this problem, they should also be on our minds.
Annie, go to you next. Annie?
Yeah,
Sorry, yeah.
yes, I can hear you. Actually, really happy that I'm here with Yuvan and others, and it's quite inspirational to, hear some positive things, that there are some solutions and people are actually, thinking. And I actually would like to end also that, it's a good fight, and we should not actually abandon it. And as journalists, as news gatherers, it's tough, but we have to keep on going. Read the fake news and hate speech and digital media. It's I would like to just talk about that too. That for example, in Pakistan's context, I think that people have learned over the last 5 years that how to verify, but it's still lots of work that needs to be done. And especially like it's an election year, so there are like many couple of initiatives. There's one like Park Votes, which I've worked earlier on as well for elections. We have actually developed social media guidelines, and we actually make to people and keep on repeating to people to verify news before putting anything. Or we kept on pressurizing media channel, and especially those influencers on Twitter, to always verify stories when they put them out feed. So it's happening, and people have started like taking down some news as well. We have seen that, okay, for example, again, I'm coming back to this Eurasia Future story, which was a fake story when it was debunked. So one of the senators who from the People's Party, one of the political parties in Pakistan, she took that story out. She deleted it from her Twitter, and she talked about it. I would leave it on a positive note that there are some solutions, and we all need to work on that.
Thank you. So, Leiden, you're next in line.
Thank
yeah,
you.
I like what Annie said. I strongly believe in importance of citizen journalism, in activists turning tables on fake news, debunking fake news just by providing information from the source. That's often what we are lacking. A lot of fake news can be easily debunked by providing from information from the source, and that wouldn't always reach all of the population that original news reached, but it will reach at least some of the people. And also, what is important for citizen journalism is to show news that has been neglected by or ignored on purpose by major news outlets. That is something that can bring difference, and that can actually involve more people in media literacy and knowledge about how news is created, where it goes, what happens, who it reaches, etc. That is actually creating more of the sources and making it easy for some people to research when they are creating some news content.
Thank you. And Yvonne, some words of wisdom for us.
Fighting fake news or fighting disinformation would involve all sectors of society, okay, government, civil society, citizens, academia, journalists, everyone. And the fight, like I said, can be a lonely one. Sometimes people ask me, will your work make a difference as a journalist or as a fact checker? And I always like to quote my favorite writer, Aldous Huxley, who has kept me going all this time, especially as a fact checker. And he says, facts don't cease to exist just because they're ignored. So it's something to, something that it's a mantra that I live by these days, especially that, so I think it might be good for people to remember that. Facts will be facts.
Facts will be facts. Thank you so much, each and every one of you, for being part of this debate. And you have helped me so much in figuring out what I'm gonna be doing here. And I, but what I've really taken to heart, and I hope the people seeing have, as I'm sure you guys have as well, is that it really is like you can't give up. It's very difficult, but you have to chip away at it. And no problem. I mean, it is definitely a very complex problem with very complex solutions, but they are there, and we just have to figure out what's the right balance between regulation and media. It's just like a right formula that we need to kind of figure out, and we will do it. I'm hopeful about that. Again, thank you everyone who's been watching. Thank you so much for taking the time to do it. Thank you all of my lovely global panelists who were able to like come awake at like 1 in the morning, and I don't know what other times there are everywhere, but thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you guys. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.